Hey there, friends. I want to welcome you back to season 3 of the Your Career Story podcast. This past summer was an absolute blast as we got to talk about what work-life balance actually means, as well as hear from experts on how we can better manage stress, heal burnout, and think about our work lives differently. It was such a gift for me. Now, here are some of our most popular episodes if you haven't tuned in and want to listen back. I highly recommend that. Number 20, how to work from home and actually get stuff done. This was a great conversation I had with my website designer and friend, Elizabeth McCravey. Number 11, the mindset that will transform your productivity at work with TJ Leffler. This guy is a genius. He's a life coach and he's an ex-WallStreeter as well, and I absolutely adore him. I had to listen to this conversation multiple times over. And number 14, how does work-life balance look different when you're single or married? This was a podcast episode that I recorded with my friend Stephanie Mae Wilson, and she actually reused it on her own podcast because it was that good. So if you want something back to listen to from season 2, pick one of those 3 episodes. You will not regret it. Okay, so what is happening this season? I have been listening. I've been hearing y'all. I've been pulling LinkedIn, Instagram, current clients, past clients, you name it. And you've all been saying the same thing. You've been saying, Jenna, we want more actionable content around how to actually succeed in our careers for the long haul. You've given me specific questions you'd love tactics and strategies on. You've told me stories of where you personally struggled. I totally hear those. And you've shown me where you've been feeling really overwhelmed at work. So I am coming in hot this season, and I am putting on the hat of your personal career coach, the not so stuffy, fast talking, actually helpful mentor you did not know that you needed. So I'll be walking you through the things your college career center should have taught you back in the day, and then some. Here are some of the topics that we're going to cover this season. I want you to hit subscribe now because you are not going to want to miss any of this. I'm going to be teaching you step-by-step how to give your personal brand a massive facelift, how to find a job across the country. You all have been asking me that question. How to create career goals you'll actually stick to. Don't we all want those? Tips to dealing with micromanaging bosses, how to quit slaving over job boards, and actually get your dream job to find you. Needless to say, we're covering a lot. But if we don't cover your specific question, we want to hear about it. Connect with me over on LinkedIn or Instagram. Search for my name, Jenna with 1 N, Viviano, and DM your most burning career questions or suggestions for what types of guests you would love to hear from on the show. One final request. If you've been following along and you've been enjoying the content you've been hearing, we would be so very honored if you headed on over to iTunes and reviewed the show. Shower us with some stars and tell us what your biggest takeaway has been from the show thus far. There are so few career-focused podcasts for my 9-to-5ers that we want more people to uncover this. We would be so very grateful. Now onwards to the show. Welcome to Your Career Story podcast, a show that's designed for rock star professionals looking for that extra booster shot of confidence in their careers. Whether you're trying to get clarity on a job transition, want some work-life balance inspiration, or need a strategy to snag that promotion or raise, this podcast is for you. I'm your host, Jenna Viviano, ex-WallStreeter turned startup junkie who now coaches hundreds of clients, empowering them to take back control of the job search and land their dream job. So sit back, grab a glass of wine, and prepare yourself for your weekly boost of career confidence. Okay, so what are we chatting about today? How are we going to kick off season 3? Well, today I'm going to walk you through how to kick fear to the curb when it comes to making a massive career change. And if there is anyone who knows a thing or two about massive career changes, it is me. When I did the calculations preparing for this podcast, I had 4 different jobs at 3 companies in 5 years. And then I launched my side hustle into a full hustle. So needless to say, I've done a lot of pivoting, so I can help a brother or sister out here if you are listening. And over the years, I've gotten a lot of questions about how I went from WallStreet to a 6-figure career coaching business. Like, what did you do to get from point A to point B? Because they seem really different. And they are. A lot of people were asking me questions about how did I get into it? How did I switch jobs? Why did I switch the jobs? How did I know it was time to take the entrepreneurial leap? All of those questions are totally valid. And I've never really answered those questions before. I've never really publicly told my story on my own platform, but today is the day. You're going to get every nitty gritty, good, bad, ugly detail on how I confidently and oftentimes not so confidently, so you can learn from my mistakes, navigated a total career overhaul. So today we're giving my personal story from Wall Street investment banker to career coach. So why don't we dive right on in? I'm going to start at the very beginning, which sounds like either a Sound of Music song or like a speech. So I'm just going to take us down back to the very beginning towards my college years, because I think a lot of us, whether you're listening to this and you're trying to place yourself into the story, which I highly recommend you doing, is thinking about like, when we were in college, what did you want to be when you grew up? So I think a lot of us go into college and we kind of have a loose idea of maybe what we want to do. Maybe our parents have insight on what they think we should do. Maybe we got some advice from some counselors, and maybe we do actually know what we want to do. But I feel like for a lot of people, a lot of us go into college preparing for a job out of school, and a lot of us down the road don't necessarily use that degree. And that was definitely my story. So for me, when I was actually in college, so I went to a school called Lehigh University. I was technically first generation in my immediate family to go to school, to go to college. My mom and dad are from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So I grew up there, and my dad owns a construction company and a couple of other businesses. And so I grew up around an entrepreneurial family, and my mom supported him and then supported us at home. And so they both were really awesome, and definitely shout out to both Stace and Bob, who helped me a lot in the college application process, even though they really, bless them, they probably had no idea what they were doing. So I went to Lehigh University, which is in Eastern Pennsylvania, and I really didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. In school, I was really interested in the arts. I was in musical theater. I did choir competitions. I was your quintessential nerd, but I really didn't know what I wanted to do. And so I knew I wanted to be in the business school, I thought. My dad kind of encouraged me in that. I was definitely a creative kid, and I was always coming up with new ideas. So I think that they kind of directed me in that direction, mainly because it was kind of funny. My dad said I should get a finance degree because he did a lot of custom decks and additions for people that were in finance. And he's like, they seem to make a lot of money. They seem to be really comfortable in what they're doing. They seem to have a lot of time off, which ended up not being the case for my finance experience. But I was like, okay, I think I can make a living doing this finance thing. I think I might be good at it. I think I like math. Maybe I'll try it. So I ended up getting a finance degree, but then I also coupled that with a marketing degree. And I honestly had no clue in the game of like how to get an internship, how to find a job. I was kind of a lost little puppy along the way, but I got blessed with some amazing professors at that university. Professor Ann Anderson, if you're ever listening to this, she was my rock during that process. And she was in the finance department, and she encouraged me to apply for an investment banking job. Now, I was not one of those kids that dreamed about becoming an investment banker my whole life. I quite frankly barely knew what the stock market was as a kid. Again, growing up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, my dad was in kind of construction and my mom was a stay-at-home mom. It just wasn't a part of our normal narrative on a day-to-day basis, where a lot of my friends that went to Lehigh, they did grow up kind of in that environment in maybe the New Jersey or New York City area. And so I applied for the job, not really thinking I would get an interview, let alone get the job. And I remember going into the interview for the internship, and I was meeting with the person who it was the head of investment banking at the firm that I was applying to. And right before my interview, this is kind of a side story that if you've ever been to an interview and you felt really uncomfortable, I've been there. My friend Anne dressed me actually for that interview, and she dressed me into this like sheath dress that was really tight and really, really uncomfortable. And I remember going to my professor's office before my interview earlier in the day, and I said, I just hate what I'm wearing. I don't feel comfortable. I had a total meltdown. She told me to go up to my house to go change and to put something that I was much more comfortable in, which, by the way, was definitely not appropriate for an interview, but I did it and it ended up landing the job. And so I had that internship before I actually entered into my senior year of school. I landed a job right before they actually asked me to extend to come on as a full-time hire for the following year after I graduated. So I was like kind of sitting pretty. I was sitting at going into school, first day of senior year, and I like already had a job. I was like ahead of the game. I felt good about myself. I definitely had a little bit of pride probably going on in there. Was just like going to coast for kind of the rest of the year. And so when you can imagine my disappointment when I get into actually the real world after I graduate and realize that maybe my investment banking job that I thought would be a good fit or would just be a good start was really my nightmare. A lot of people get asking some questions like, what do investment bankers really do? Why do they spend so many hours at the workplace? Quite frankly, I don't really know the full answer to that. I think there's a lot of inconsistencies with what bankers kind of do and kind of the chain of management. But essentially in those days in an analyst position, I was a glorified PowerPoint maker and Excel model builder. That's basically what I did all day long. Turned comments is what they use the phrase in investment banking. And so when I entered into that job into a full-time capacity, after we went through like kind of 3 months of training, I went into this job and I was miserable. I was working probably 7 days a week, 80 hours to 100 hours a week. I mean, I was working a lot of hours. And I got to this point where, I had transitioned out of school. There was a lot of change going on in my life. Hurricane Sandy happened in New York that year. I got displaced from my home. And I started to develop a really, really bad eating disorder. So if you are somebody who is listening, male or female, and you've had an eating disorder, you know how much that can wreak havoc on your entire life, not just your health, but quite frankly, every aspect of your life. And so because I was working so many hours, I was so stressed out with where I was, this eating disorder just kind of like went rampant. And there was a lot of things that were happening in the workplace that just weren't a good fit for me. I just couldn't sustain the hours. I really didn't love finance. It really wasn't my thriving point. The worst place to figure out that you're bad at something is when you're in that profession. So I realized I was bad at finance working on Wall Street. Definitely not advisable. But I was working 100-hour work weeks. My parents were really worried about me. I was constantly glued to my BlackBerry. And I got to this point where I was sitting at work. We'll never forget this. I was on the 32nd floor of my building, laying on the bathroom floor on a Saturday morning. And I remember I had just kind of had an episode with my eating disorder, and I was laying on the bathroom floor, and I remember praying because I hadn't been really connected to my faith in a really long time in an active way. I grew up in a Christian home. We went to a Presbyterian church growing up, but I really I would say that I wasn't really a follower of Jesus until I worked on Wall Street. And I remember sitting on my floor and I said, God, I don't know if you're real, but if you're real, you have got to get me out of here. And a couple of days later, one of my sorority sisters from Lehigh actually contacted me, and she knew I was really unhappy in my job, and she was very gracious. And she said, actually, Jenna, I heard about this role at the New York Stock Exchange that we're going to have opening up. I think you'd be a really good fit. You need to get out of your current position. And I remember going to that interview. It was 8:00 in the morning, and I had just been on kind of a work bender, as I like to call it, the night before. I'd worked really, really late, probably till 2:00 in the morning or something crazy. And I had this 8:00 interview, and I was not prepared for that interview at all whatsoever. I went into that interview. I didn't know what I was saying. The managing director asked me a question that was a very simple finance question that I should have known the answer to. And I didn't have an answer for her. I just kind of started tearing up. And I was like, honestly, I'm just really tired. I don't know the answer. So if you've ever had a bad interview before, it probably doesn't get worse than that. And for whatever reason, that team decided to bring me on. I think that they saw that I was hungry, that I probably could accomplish the work if I was given it, and that I had gotten into investment banking. So maybe there was some correlation between the two. The job was definitely not exactly the same as an investment banking job, moving over to a capital markets position at the New York Stock Exchange. And so I was just so grateful. And I remember I was about to quit my job, and I remember going into the head of the department's office, and he had given me the opportunity to work for him, intern with his team the year before. He kind of advocated for me. He helped me go abroad and intern abroad, which is a totally different story and super cool. And I just felt so much guilt about quitting that job and leaving. But I knew, and we're going to be talking about this in next week's episode of how do you know if it's time to move on from a job? I knew I was so physically ill and just mentally drained that it just was not a good fit for me. And I went to his office and I was crying. I was just waterworks everywhere. And I said, I'm so sorry, but I'm leaving. I'm going to the New York Stock Exchange. And I was just crying. I just looked like a total fool. Definitely not a way that I would advise people to quit their jobs or to tell their boss that they're going to exit and move to somewhere else. But he was so gracious with me. And I will never forget the words that he said. He told me that I said this to you whenever you first came into the office, that you're going to change the world someday. And I meant those words when I said that. And I was like a 23-year-old girl who was a mess. I didn't know which way was up or down. I had no idea what my purpose was. I didn't know who I was, my identity, which we'll talk about at some point probably in this podcast series. I just didn't know who I was. And in an opportunity where he had to, be upset with me or mad with me, he was so gracious and said, this job isn't for everybody. And I'm glad you found out now. And I'm happy for you as you move on into the future. And it's funny, I actually emailed him a couple of months ago, and I kind of told him about how his words really impacted my life positively. And that just goes to show that you never know what positive words could affect the trajectory of somebody else's career. And I've kind of spent the rest of my career proving him correct or trying to prove him correct, that those words were not said in vain. So the biggest takeaway that I learned from that experience is that God is totally going to provide. I said that prayer on the bathroom floor when I was at my lowest of low points. And a couple weeks later, I had a job at the New York Stock Exchange, and I do not think that is coincidence. I do not think that is mistake. And the other thing I learned from that experience is that money doesn't solve every problem. So I think a lot of people get into a profession because they think the money's there, or they're going to be quote unquote successful, or people are going to be jealous of them. That is for sure my sin, and for sure the areas where I have the most pride. And I went into that job because I thought that I was going to be somebody important. I didn't go into that job because it was my skills or my strengths or my giftings. I went to that job because I thought someone was going to think that I was important. I was really prideful of that position. But I'm so grateful that God kind of took my feet underneath me, had me hit face first, down flat on the ground, and then he kind of pulled me up from the ashes from there. And so I moved on from the investment banking position and was pretty much had no confidence left in me. If you have been in a job where you feel like you are failing constantly, you probably know that feeling where you're like, I have no confidence in myself. Am I even good at anything? Does anyone actually think that I will be successful at anything? That is kind of how I felt. And so it really took me about a year to get my confidence back up when I worked at the New York Stock Exchange. And that team that I had there was just the sweetest of people. I still keep in contact with a couple of the managers there. And time again, I'll talk with some of the people that were kind of my colleagues. But those people, I kind of joke that they saved me from investment banking. I had some amazing managers, my senior boss, and he just really saw what I was good at and what I wasn't good at, and kind of started to lean me towards the things that I was really good at. And so I started to gain my confidence back slowly over time. In that division, I got the opportunity. The capital markets department at that time was told, and what we kind of did on a day-to-day basis was pitch companies as to why they should list their stock on the New York Stock Exchange versus NASDAQ, or NASQAQ, as we would jokingly say in the office. And so it was a really fun time, especially when I was there. I call it the IPO boom. There were so many companies that were going public during that time period that I got to be a part of. So I got to see SeaWorld go public. We had like penguins on the floor, which was so cool. This was right after the documentary Blackfish came out. So that was a little controversial, but those animals, let me tell you, were treated like royalty. They were like on private planes. They had it was pretty cool. So we got to go see SeaWorld go public, GoDaddy go public. I got to see Twitter go public, which was so cool. That was an amazing experience of being through that pitch process between us and NASDAQ, which was very competitive. If you're familiar at all with the stock market and how the financial markets work, it was a very competitive process between us and NASDAQ getting Twitter. I was actually on a part of the team that helped pitch Alibaba, which at the time was the biggest IPO in the history of the world. So I'm very proud of that. And it was such a cool experience to kind of see just kind of what we had to do to get that company to come list at the New York Stock Exchange. I won't give you all the details. It's probably not allowed, quite frankly, to give all the details, but it was such a cool experience. And it was such a moment of pride for us to really get to do that. I got to see the Container Store go public. I got to see Hilton go public. I had an awesome robe that they gave me that was like a Hilton robe that had their ticker symbol on the back of it for a while. I got to see Vince go public. So if you're a fashionista of some sort, you might know that organization. At the time, they had an all-female management team, which was so cool. They gave me a couple of free outfits that I could wear when I did their webcast, which we'll get into. We got to see Grubhub go public, which is like seamless to some of you who may live in an area that doesn't have Grubhub. And if you guys remember Candy Crush, that game that everyone was obsessed with for a long time, the company that created that game, King, actually went public too. There were like these cool little Candy Crush items, or like blow up kind of dolls that were on the floor. Anyways, I digress. It was a really cool time to work at the New York Stock Exchange. And I loved being on the floor. I loved getting to know the traders. I loved that I got to actually meet the people that worked there. I think a lot of people have opinions about Wall Street, and some of them are totally founded that it's greedy and all. You know, you hear the Gordon Gekko movie maybe in your mindset. But I actually got to know the people that worked there, and I got to meet their families. I got to see like what they actually care about outside the office. And a lot of those people that worked on the trading floor were amazing men and women, mostly men, yes, true, but men that were really supportive and actually cheered me on the trading floor. So one of the things that I got to experience when I worked there was was one day they just kind of threw me out on the trading floor and like, hey, you should try webcasting. Just report live from the trading floor. Tell us what's going on. We're going to take that webcast. We're going to take it back to the company's employees that's IPOing so they can be a part of the process. I had no clue what I was doing, friends. So here's the rule of thumb that I learned from that and that I continue to reiterate in my own career and what I teach my coaching clients is that when somebody gives you an opportunity, just say yes. Say yes to that opportunity, even if it scares the bejeebers out of you. I had not had any practice in front of a camera I don't think ever, quite frankly, if I'm thinking about it now. I don't think I've ever had experience in front of a camera. I had done theater work when I was in high school, but that was like years and years and years ago. It had been a long time since I had done any type of public speaking on a regular basis. But every kind of Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, or Thursday, Friday when companies would start to go public, I would be down there on the floor reporting live from the stock exchange. And I think that what that did is it helped me realize that, hey, I might be good at something other than finance. And that is 100% totally okay. Okay, all my wannabe career changers, it is time to make some moves. You've been in analysis paralysis for way too stinking long, and it's time to take a leap of faith. Quit just consuming articles about changing careers and actually start taking action. I've personally experienced every fear that you're probably feeling right now. Self-doubt, fear of not using my degree, fear of failing, overwhelmed that there are way too many options, paralyzed because I'm petrified of making a terrible move and ending up destitute on the side of the road with no money to my name and shame written across my forehead. Sound familiar? It doesn't have to be so hopeless. It can actually be fun, which is why I created an actionable guide to get you out of your paralysis and into your dream job, even if you're not sure what that is just yet. If you've been feeling like it's time to make a move for 6 months or more, but don't know where to start, I have just the resource for you. My What's Your Next Career Move guide. In this clarity guide, I walk you through 4 simple stages that will move you from hopeless to hopeful in your career. Head on over to www.jennaviviano.com/career-clarity to snag your free copy. In this guide, I give you questions to journal through and action steps you can start making today to get yourself out of overwhelm and into structure and peace. I've worked with over 900 clients from around the world and walked through this exact framework, and it works. So if you're looking to change careers, you need to head on over to www.jennaviviano.com/career-clarity and grab my free What's Your Next Career Move guide. One of the things that we often forget when we are kind of going through the process of figuring out what we want to do with our lives, we get so stuck in focusing on the things that we're not good at and fixing those things that we forget about focusing on the things that we actually are really gifted at. And so I realized quite quickly through that experience at the New York Stock Exchange that I was really, really good at talking to people. My favorite part about my job was doing those webcasts. And the other favorite part about my job was actually giving the CEOs tours of the New York Stock Exchange. Now, I wasn't going to become a tour manager or a tour guide later in my life, but those skill sets I realized were probably pretty good for a different opportunity. Other things during that experience, and what I want to remind you of, if you are a new grad, or even if you're not a new grad, if you're just somebody in a new job, soak in as much information as possible. I learned so much during that experience about what great leadership looks like. I had an amazing, amazing leader that I worked under, and he taught me so much about what it looks like to cultivate a team environment, what it looks like to really treat your employees with respect, but also require excellence. I mean, I learned so much from that man, and I'm so grateful to him. I still talk to him on a regular basis, so keep up with people that you used to work with. They are awesome advocates for you in your career, and he's been that for me. So I think one of the biggest things that we can learn when we're transitioning careers is compare the two, and not in a bad way. See what you loved about the last position, see what you like about this job. And the goal with every career pivot really is to help yourself go a quarter of a turn closer to what you enjoy doing. So moving from investment banking to the New York Stock Exchange, I got a quarter of a turn closer without even realizing it to what I wanted to be doing. I wanted to be in front of people. I wanted to be speaking. I wanted to be teaching. I wanted to be selling. Like all of those things I was really kind of good at, but didn't have the opportunity to showcase those skills. So if someone gives you the opportunity, say yes. And then when you're given that opportunity, notice, what are you good at? What do you enjoy doing? And don't ignore those prompts. Those things are there for a reason. And I think that for me, that was God's way of showing me, I see you. I see your giftings. I gifted you in this way. Now I want you to do more of that. So there came a point at the organization when I realized that it was probably time for me to move on. Leadership had kind of changed over. And again, next week, tune into that episode. We're going to talk all about 5 different ways that you can know it's time to move on. And one of those ways is, do you not agree with leadership anymore? It's not that I didn't agree with them when I worked there. It was just that it had changed over and the vibe was different. I know I was ready for a new challenge. I had been there for about 2 years. And what I really realized when I worked at the New York Stock Exchange is I was super curious. I just allowed myself to be curious. And I realized I loved seeing these companies that went from nothing and turned into something really cool whenever they listed at the New York Stock Exchange. It was such a celebration moment to be on the floor and watch these CEOs had birthed these like business babies basically, and watch them grow over time, have more employees and bring them to fruition of actually going public. That was such a huge, cool accomplishment. I wanted to be a part of a company that was doing that. So I pretty much decided that I wanted to work for a startup at that point. And I started doing a ton of research. I spent about 6 months researching different types of startups, seeing which ones I was interested in. I was heavily networking during this time period. I probably didn't apply to a job until at least like a month or 2 before I actually got my job and switched jobs. I knew early on the power of networking. I got my first job through networking and my second job through networking. So I knew my third job, especially if I wanted to make a career change, had to be no different. So if you're listening to this and you want to make a confident career change, you want to make a massive pivot in your career, the best way to do that is to start networking today. And so I started doing research on LinkedIn. I started doing research online, and I stumbled across this site called themuse.com in my search for how to figure out how to change careers. And I actually found it because every year I would look at my favorite day of the year was, well, I had 2 favorite days of the year. My first favorite day of the year was the first Monday in May. And if you're from New York City, or if you're into fashion, you know what the first Monday in May is. It's the Met Gala. But my second favorite day of the year was when the Forbes 30 Under 30 notification would come out. They would announce who made it on the Forbes 30 Under 30. And my goal was always to get onto that list. I'm about 30 in less than a month. By the time you guys hear this, I'll probably be 30. And so I haven't made it on that list, but I loved reading that list every year. And I stumbled across these 2 women, Catherine and Alex. And I was like, those women know what's up. They see the value in careers. And from my own experience, because I had had such a terrible experience and then such a great experience, I knew I wanted to keep being a part of an organization that had a great mission that I believed in. And so I actually applied online to themuse.com and for their sales position, because I had decided at that point, after talking to some people, that I was interested in making a massive career pivot. And during that process, when I was exploring like what was I actually good at, I actually have a document or a resource that is going to be really valuable for you. That's the career clarity guide that I have that walks through the 4 stages that I went through in my own personal journey, from being really stuck of like, what the heck do I do with my life, to figuring out what I wanted to do and then making action upon that. So that we include that in the show notes. So just make sure that you check those out after this episode. We talk all about career clarity. But so when I was in that position, I was just really exploring what I was interested in. And so I started talking to people that were in sales, because I thought, I think I could do that. I have some transferable skills. I could definitely pitch myself in that arena. And so I started talking to people and reaching out to people at companies I was potentially interested in working at that were in the sales department. Because what that did was it got me in front of those individuals that were at companies I was interested in, and it helped me understand, do I actually want to do this? A lot of people, when they make a massive career pivot, is they're so worried about not actually liking the career once they make the pivot. And that's a totally valid concern. And I had that too. But instead of looking at it as this like white knuckling experience, what if you looked at it as some opportunity just to be really curious about what's ahead? And so that is really the kind of mantra that I took, and how I actually got my foot in the door at the Muse. And so applied online, and I actually got denied, because, which kind of makes sense. I'm a girl from finance going to work for a sales company that's a startup, and I have no sales experience. Like, I didn't even have a retail experience when I worked like in high school or something like that. I think I worked for Annie Ann's for about 2 hot seconds, and that was about it. And so it kind of made sense that they denied me. And I was telling a friend of mine who worked at the New York Stock Exchange, and I said, I'm really trying to figure out where I want to go next. I'm having a little bit of trouble. And she goes, well, why don't you just apply to the Muse? And so that's why I applied. I told her, I gave her an update. I was like, I didn't get in. They denied me. And she's like, well, let me see if I might know somebody. So she happened to know someone who knows someone who knows someone who knows someone who knew Catherine, the CEO. And we got my resume on her desk. And it was just a simple thing of asking. So some of you may be thinking, oh, that's nice for you, Jenna. You were in New York City. You knew someone. The reality is again, blue collar, Pennsylvania, grew up with my dad who was not in corporate. My mom wasn't in corporate. I didn't know anyone on Wall Street, got on Wall Street. I didn't know anybody in tech. I got into tech. And the thing was, I didn't really take no for an answer, and I didn't take offense when somebody didn't respond back to me. I just kind of put it out there and hoped somebody would respond. And finally somebody did. And Catherine brought me in and she was like, well, she came as a reference, so I'm assuming she's probably intelligent. Let's just see how she does. And so I went through the interview process and they hired me, this finance girl turned sales girl. And I asked my boss later, Doug, he was an amazing leader as well. And I asked him, I said, why did you hire me? Like, girlfriend had no skills at all whatsoever. Why did you hire me? And he told me it was because I sold myself really well. And so if I sold myself really well, then I might be able to sell their product as well. And so that was the biggest like kind of turning point in my career. That the number one thing that I learned from that was that they say it's high risk, high reward for a reason. And it was definitely a risky move for me. I had a couple of other options that were brewing behind the scenes, but I felt really, really called and felt a peace, which again, I talk about next week about how to know if it's the right place to move to. I felt a peace about working at the Muse. It didn't make any logical sense. I was getting paid less than I made at the New York Stock Exchange, living in New York City. That is nothing that you want to mess with. It was mostly commission. And it was in a field that I was not really familiar with or had a ton of experience with. It was a huge, huge risk, but I felt like I was supposed to be there. I felt at home there. And we were in this really small, it was kind of, I think it was actually an apartment building, and they turned and converted into an office. It was in, I think it was in the Flatiron District is actually where we were for that first office. We were in 3 different offices in 2 years. And so actually technically 4, I guess, in 2 years. So we moved around and we grew really fast, but I was about the 33rd employee. I think I was about the 10th or 11th salesperson that they had on the team. It was pre-Series A round of funding. They had just kind of secured that. And we actually celebrated the Series A round of funding closing during my first week. And then I got to experience that company. And that was the wildest, most fun ride that I think I've ever been on in my career, even probably more so than me with my own business. And the reason why is because, again, I learned so much. I was a student of my career. And that's really what I've been my entire time, is just constantly wanting to learn, evolve, and grow, and looking for opportunities within organizations I was already in to learn, evolve, and grow. And so I worked at that organization. I helped launch the Texas market, kind of the Houston area, and getting more people to be listed on the Muse. So I sold a talent acquisition product, essentially service for these talent acquisition leaders. And it was a blast. It was so fun. By the time I left there in about 2 years, about 160 employees, I think, is kind of where we topped out at when I was leaving. About a year into that position, we realized that we might need it, because we were growing so fast, we might need somebody to help with sales training. So I kind of pitched myself as to why I thought I would be the right person. They created a job description, let people internally apply for it. And I sold myself internally. I was like, this is why you need to hire me for this role. I really want to do it. I think I can provide value in these ways. And they hired me. And so I started to develop the sales training program over the course of the next year or so before I left to go do my own full-time thing. But the things that I really learned from that was just take chances. You never know where they're going to lie. It was definitely not the quote unquote wise choice, the logical choice, the choice that everyone else would necessarily make, but it was the right choice for me and where I was in my career. And I thought, what do I really got to lose? I just could find another job if this thing doesn't work out. And it was during that process that I actually started my career coaching side hustle. So I worked for this company called themuse.com. It's a career advice site. If you've never heard of it before, I'm always promoting it and telling people about it, because I do think that it is one of the best career resources out there. On the platform, you can find jobs, look at inside companies to see if they have a great culture for you or not. It has great career advice, and they also have coaches that you can hire. When I realized that I wanted to be an entrepreneur, I realized that I could start a side hustle first to kind of get my feet wet, see what I liked, what I didn't like. And so I started asking my friends, like, what was I good at? What did you think that I was gifted at, or you were impressed by, or you came to me for advice on? Like, what are things that you think that I'm good at? And I kind of let that be the question that I start asking people. I think I actually got that idea from Marie Forleo. So if you're in the online marketing world, or if you've ever thought about starting a side hustle, I highly recommend her B School. I did the B School. And I thought it was helpful in helping me discern and get clarity on what my idea was for the future. And so I thought to myself, okay, so I want to do this side hustle. So I started asking friends, and I realized a lot of them had questions about how I switched jobs so many times. And at first I really resisted it. At the time I was writing a blog. It was called Giant in Heels. It was very not successful. Didn't get me very far. I thought about being a fashion blogger. I had all these like dreams and aspirations that didn't really come to fruition. I was processing through a lot with my faith during that time period, and I was using that blog as that option. And so I really wanted to talk about that kind of stuff more than I wanted to talk about careers, quite frankly. But I realized that a lot of people were asking me for advice on that. So I did a couple of things. I kind of blasted my friends and I said, hey, I'm going to be doing this kind of career coaching thing. If any of your friends need help rewriting their resume, send them to me. I'll do theirs for free if they then send me to another one of their friends. And so I did the first resume for free from a friend of a friend. And he directed me to somebody else. And she was my first client. And I think I charged about $100 per hour, which at the time probably, I don't even know why I charged that amount. I couldn't even tell you. And I would meet with her kind of on a weekly basis or every other week basis. And we would talk through what she was struggling with in the workplace and how to get from point A to point B and get her some clarity. And so I started to kind of get clients, here and there, word of mouth, not doing a ton of promotion. I launched a Squarespace website, which I used pretty much for the first 2 years of my business and didn't change it until about a year into my full-time gig. So I had that Squarespace. So if you're thinking about starting a company and you're like, I don't want to deal with the whole website management thing, Squarespace is a great, great resource that I highly recommend. But I started this website, and at the same time, simultaneously, the Muse launched their career coaching platform. And I thought to myself, oh no. They're totally going to think that I'm stealing this idea. I'm working behind their backs. And so I just kind of was like, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? And then my boss, Doug, kind of came to me and he said, I saw that you're kind of launching your own career coaching thing. I said, I know, I'm sorry. I was going to tell you, it was da-da-da-da-da. I start rambling, as I do. And he said, well, I kind of told the leaders that maybe they should consider you as one of the coaches. And I said, actually, that'd be a great idea, because then I can give insight to y'all as to what the experience is like from the coach's perspective. And so they interviewed me, they onboarded me, and that's kind of how I got on the Muses platform, which I was super grateful for. I had to go through the whole writing test, all the things to make sure that you were qualified to kind of coach people through things. And I started to build my business up on there, and I started to get more reviews, and I started to build the business, and I started to get more and more clients and more clients. And I got to this point in my business where I was like, oh no. I'm working basically 2 full-time jobs and I cannot sustain this. And so when I was going through that process of being like, oh no, I need to figure out what I'm doing next, it's either do or die, I got to this point where I was making enough money where it didn't exactly surpass the income that I was making in my full-time job, but it was enough that it gave me confidence that if I took this thing full-time, I could actually make it work. And I was doing this not just in the crevices of my day or in the afternoons or after work or on the weekends or whatever, but I actually did this from a full-time capacity. I think I could scale this thing. And so I had made the decision. There were a couple of things that happened in my personal life and church life that made me decide it was time to actually leave New York City. And so I moved from New York City and decided to move to Nashville. And that is when I launched my business full time 2 years ago. And it has been running ever since. So a lot of people ask me, what is the reason for, how do you know when it's time to actually move your side hustle to a full hustle? I'm a firm believer in doing a side hustle to full hustle. I don't think that it's often very wise just to launch something without having anything to kind of fall back on. It puts a lot of pressure on yourself financially. And for me, that pivot was so easy. My transition from side hustle to full hustle, people don't want to hear that, but it was seamless because I had made plans and I had prepared for it and I had known what worked for my clientele and what didn't work for my clientele. Now I've been on an upward learning curve since then, and there are so many other things to unpack in a different episode about how do I run my business, how do I package things that I've learned over the years, mistakes I've made. But the biggest thing for me was learning that going from side hustle to full hustle didn't have to be so difficult if I actually worked up to that point. So I've been scaling since then, and I'm so excited about this next season of life. I have gone from working with a lot of people one-on-one to just kind of churning through that, doing a lot of resumes, to building out longer-term partnerships with people that are looking to make much more strategic moves, to now going to be launching some courses that are coming out this fall, and I'm so pumped about it. So across the board, you just never know what God has up his sleeve. And that's the one thing that I've learned throughout this entire process is that God is always up to something, even if you don't know what that thing is. He was working in my first job. He was working in my second job. He was working in my third and fourth job at the Muse. He's working in my business. And I believe he's going to continue working in the future. And that is something that I kind of rest my head on every night. When I wake up every morning, I know I'm like, okay, God, what are we doing today? What thing do you want me to accomplish? How do you want to live out my call? And we're going to be talking a lot in kind of the next season actually about faith at work because it's something I'm so passionate about. And I just briefly touched on it. It's a huge part of my story of how I came to faith. I was working on Wall Street and I came to faith basically through a coworker, but I will just leave that cliffhanger there because I'm going to be talking a lot more about that in the future of how that actually happened, why I believe we're all called to be in ministry, even if we're not ministers or pastors or in youth ministry or something like that. So if you're a believer, if you're a person of faith, stay tuned for those episodes because we're definitely going to be talking about that. But overall, I have never regretted any of the moves that I've made in my career. I have always been running towards something, not just away from something. And I think that's where a lot of people get confused when they're navigating a total career overhaul. They're just like wanting to like throw in the chips. I'm so done with what I'm currently doing. All I want to do is move on to the next thing. And while I totally get that, make sure that you are strategically running towards something and not just running away from something. Some pivots are definitely harder than others. I was a total example of that. Going from finance to sales is not easy, and it took me a long time, but I was patient with the process. I gave myself grace, and I had vision for the future. Some are really scary to walk out in faith. That was very clear for me when I did actually take the job, was like, oh my gosh, am I going to make any money? And even when I took my career full-time or my business full-time, I had the same exact feeling like, oh my gosh, am I going to make any money? So I totally feel you, friends. And here's the one thing that I've learned as I reflected back on every single one of my pivots. Before every pivot, there is fear. During every pivot, there is a faith-fueled excitement. And after every pivot, if done correctly, is relief and fulfillment. So don't just stay stuck because you're fearful. I want you to listen to the nudging of that inner voice because it is rarely wrong. I find it very rare that it is wrong. And too many of us want the sure thing, whatever that actually looks like for us. We want to be secure and know that nothing bad's going to happen. And quite frankly, whether you're in a corporate job or you're working for yourself, quote unquote, bad things can happen. You can lose your job tomorrow just as easily as you gained it. So sometimes our logic really keeps us stuck and it becomes an excuse rather than an aid. So I'm all for making strategic decisions and not just throwing any risk and being like, oh, I'm just going to take the riskiest option available. I don't believe in that necessarily. I believe in strategic risk. But just make sure that your logic, your quote unquote being strategic, is not becoming an excuse because it's very easy for that to do that. So here's the thing. If you're not uncomfortable, friends, you're not growing. And if you're not growing, you're going to get bored. And if you're bored in your career, you're definitely 100% going to be lacking fulfillment. And then you're stuck in the mud without a way out, and that's not great. We don't want that. So if you know in your gut that you need a total career overhaul, you can absolutely do that. Take my story as something that if I can do it with no technical connections to any of the industries I actually got into, if I can do that, if I can get my way from point A to point B, you absolutely positively can do that. So to close out, friends, I want you to ponder this. Career overhauls are only as scary as you make them. Next week, I'm giving you all the reasons you need to be sure it's time to make a career change. So I will see you there next week, same time, same place. Hey, y'all, thanks so much for listening to Your Career Story podcast. I would love to get to meet you. And there are a couple of ways that we can connect in between episodes. First and foremost, you know I love my LinkedIn. Second is via Instagram. And third is over on my website. I actually have a special spot just for you full of fun, free resources. So all you have to do is go to www.jennaviviano.com/resources. Super simple for a bunch of freebies that will help you boost your career. Hope to see you next week.